The people in this story were not heroes. They were lower-class soldiers, sailors, and civilians, abandoned by their leaders to die in the open ocean. For years, their government tried to pretend they never existed, until a single painting forced the world to look them in the eye. This map shows the coastline of Senegal in West Africa. In the summer of 1816, the French frigate Méduse was tasked with reinstating a colonial outpost. Instead, it ran violently aground on a sandbank off the coast of present-day Mauritania. The man at the wheel was Viscount Hugues du Roy de Chamarez. He was an aristocrat, handed command by the newly restored Bourbon monarchy as a political favor. Prior to taking the helm of the Méduse, he hadn't sailed a ship in over 20 years. Chamarez ignored the warnings of more experienced officers and drove the ship directly into a well-charted sandbank. This grounding was the direct result of a system that valued noble bloodlines over basic naval competence. With the hull cracking, the evacuation protocol became a question of class. There were 400 people on board, but the available lifeboats could only hold 250. The captain, the wealthy elites, and the senior officers claimed the seats for themselves. That left 147 lower-class passengers and crew members behind. They were forced onto an unstable wooden raft built from salvaged floorboards, measuring roughly 20 by 7 meters. The plan was for the lifeboats to tow the heavy raft to shore. Within hours, the lifeboats began to drag. Rather than risk their own safety to pull the waterlogged raft, the captain and his officers took an axe to the tow lines. They sailed away, leaving 147 people stranded in the Atlantic with barely any food or water. The Bourbon government immediately tried to suppress the story of the captain's cowardice, but the leaked survivor accounts caught the attention of a 25-year-old artist named Théodore Géricault, who refused to let the scandal be buried. To Géricault, the crime wasn't just the shipwreck, it was the deliberate abandonment and the government's attempt to erase the victims from history. The raft was a death trap from the moment the ropes were severed. It had no sails, no oars, and no navigational tools. The sheer weight of 147 people pushed the wooden planks below the surface, leaving the passengers standing waist-deep in freezing water. Social order evaporated on the very first night. Soldiers and sailors broke into wine casks and launched violent mutinies in the dark. Officers fought back with sabers, and dozens of people were slaughtered or thrown into the ocean. By the fourth day, the surviving men had exhausted their meager rations. To avoid starving to death, they began to butcher the corpses of their dead crewmates, hanging strips of human flesh from the rigging to dry. They drifted for 13 days. When a rescue vessel finally spotted them, the 147 passengers had been reduced to just 15 emaciated survivors. On the raft, professional soldiers and sailors found themselves dying at the hands of the aristocratic incompetence that gripped the French Navy. Class warfare and professional resentment had turned the vessel into a floating hell. This is the title page of the published narrative written by two of those survivors, the surgeon Henri Savigny and the engineer Alexandre Corriard. Géricault began his investigation by tracking them down and recording their first-hand testimony. To understand the physics of the disaster, Géricault hired the actual surviving carpenter of the Méduse. He commissioned a mathematically precise scale model of the raft, floating it in water to see exactly how it pitched and rolled. Then his research turned macabre. Géricault visited Parisian morgues to study the biology of putrefaction. He carried severed limbs and decaying body parts back to his studio, arranging them alongside his easels to study the exact colors of death. He shaved his head, locked his doors, and lived in isolation for months. He immersed himself in the smell of rot and the recorded accounts of starving men to recreate their reality. Géricault transformed his studio into a workspace of data and rot, using survivor accounts and the model to document a crime rather than illustrate legends. His massive canvas is a physical confrontation. At the bottom, an eulogy of death. The composition thrusts upward along straining backs toward the mast, but the distance holds the cruelest detail, a tiny, disappearing rescue ship, leaving them in profound despondency. The physical geometry traps us in psychological torture, suspended between hope and doom. At the peak, signaling for help, is Jean-Charles. Jean-Charles was the only black survivor of the raft. In an era of slavery, Géricault made a marginalized black man the central symbol of human endurance, and the savior of the group. This engraving shows the Palace of the Louvre, where the painting was unveiled in 1819. It caused an immediate political scandal, shocking the elite classes who were forced to confront a massive, realistic depiction of their own regime's failure. The ocean nearly erased these people, and the government desperately wanted to move on. But by acting as an investigator and an artist, Géricault took a story the state wanted to bury and hung it in the king's salon, ensuring the victims remained visible forever.